Hello, everyone. I'm Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and director of MintCast News and your host of the MintCast podcast. I'm also joined by my co-host and our senior staff writer, the brilliant Alan MacLeod. Hi, Alan.
Hello, Mnar. How are you?
Good. This show, the MintCast, is made possible by supporters like you, as we and all independent media outlets face major shadow banning on many of the platforms. And the crackdown on independent anti-war watchdog journalism intensifies. We ask that you support us by becoming a member on our Patreon page, which we will link in the comments. The MintCast podcast is also available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. And I just actually received some of those analytics for the podcast. We received, I think it was over 100,000 downloads in the course of just a few months. So we were pretty happy about that, giving us better numbers than YouTube has. So we appreciate everybody's support. The war in Ukraine is well now into its second year, and the United States is insisting on pumping billions more into the quagmire that has seen thousands of lives lost and millions displaced. So recently, the U.S. has approved more than $113 billion in aid to Ukraine, most of that being weapons, making companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon very happy as these profits and these sales line their pockets. So this year, President Biden has approved a record-breaking $842 billion war budget. Yet much of this is not even directed towards Ukraine or Russia, but actually directed towards China. So not content with turning Europe into a war zone, it seems the US wants to do the same to Asia, spending huge sums of a ring of bases, supposedly to protect and defend from a Chinese threat in the South China Sea. To break down the war in Ukraine, China, and the permanent war economy, we are very excited to be joined again by author and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges. And you can find his work at hedges.substack.com. And we also republish many of his op-eds and analysis pieces. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mnar.
So even as the Ukraine conflict continues unabated, war planners in Washington are gearing up for another potential conflict, this time with China. Could you lay some of the provocative U.S. actions out and perhaps tell us how serious a threat you think this possibility is?
Well, it's a serious threat given the mindset of the warmongers who dominate the Washington establishment. And I know many of them. I have dealt with them going all the way back to the conflicts in Central America. So, for instance, when I covered the war in El Salvador, I spent 5 years covering that war. During the Reagan administration, Elliott Abrams was in the State Department, and his deputy was Robert Kagan. And their job was to discredit what we reporters and photographers were documenting on the ground, the kinds of atrocities that were being committed almost daily by the Salvadoran military and the death squads, as well as the murderous rampages by Rios Montt in Guatemala. These are shills for war. It doesn't matter how wrong they are. I, of course, encountered them again in 1989 when I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. So I was present when promises were made by the German foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and then Secretary of State James Baker to Gorbachev not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Well, NATO was expanded in violation of that promise. Why? Two reasons. One, the U.S., with the collapse of the Soviet Union, saw Russia as a weak, even failed state that was of no concern, so it was hubris. They spoke about the end of a multipolar world and a new unipolar world, in essence, dominated, a global domination by the United States. And then there were billions upon billions of dollars to be made by making militaries in Central and Eastern Europe compatible with NATO equipment. So those two reasons, they were aware that these were provocations to Russia. They didn't care. WikiLeaks released an internal email by William Burns, now the head of the CIA, was then ambassador to Russia, that talked about Ukraine being a red line. So it's not like they weren't aware, they didn't care. And then, of course, the 2014 coup. So it comes out of hubris. It comes out of feeding the arms industry. You mentioned the, $854 billion arms budget. When you count other budgets, Veterans Affairs and nuclear, it actually comes closer to $1 trillion a year. But 400 billion of that goes directly into the pockets of the arms manufacturers, and you have a staggering number of former admirals, generals who sit on the boards. I mean, in fact, of course, Lloyd Austin came off of the board of was it General Dynamics? We can't remember which one it was. So there's that kind of cross-pollination between the arms industry. I think that part of the reason also in the expansion of NATO was that they needed to, if Russia wouldn't be the enemy, they couldn't justify the expansion of NATO unless they forced Russia to be the enemy. And that's the tragedy, because Gorbachev wanted both security and economic alliances with the United States and the West, as did Yeltsin, as people forget, in the early years did Putin. So we have these shills of the war industry. Their think tanks are all funded by the war industry, Brookings and Heritage, and they never go away. It doesn't matter how wrong they are. They were all cheerleaders, of course, for the war in Iraq. But they represent those interests. And they are creations of the Washington establishment. They don't actually know war. They know very little about geopolitics. Their entire frame of reference is World War II and Munich. Everybody's the new Hitler. Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler. Putin's the new Hitler. I guess Xi will eventually become the new Hitler. And it's all about expansion and domination. And then, so the goal, of course, this proxy war in Ukraine has nothing to do with Ukraine or democracy. It has to do with degrading the Russian military and isolating Putin from Europe, largely achieved, certainly in terms of the isolation of Putin. However, they are fully aware that a long war of attrition is one they probably can't win, despite what appear to be pretty heavy losses on the part of the Russians. And I think that's why they're kind of crossing every red line that they impose in terms of arms shipments. And now, of course, we're talking about F-16 fighter jets because it's a kind of Hail Mary. I think they gave them, 31 or 33 M1 Abrams tanks. Those are relatively useless without air cover, nor is it a particularly large number. Also, Abrams are very temperamental. I was in the last tank battle in the first Gulf War with Abrams. They're very unforgiving to mistakes. They take their maintenance heavy. They're very temperamental vehicles and need almost constant maintenance. I don't think that I think most probably planners understand, NATO planners, that it won't make a huge difference. But I think it's part of the desperation that the longer the war goes on, the worse it is for Ukraine. All that said, the chief objectives of the war, of the proxy war, are being achieved very cynically with Ukrainian blood and the destruction of Ukraine. I think no one expects the Ukrainians to retake the Donbass, whether it's Henry Kissinger or the editorial board of the New York Times, both of whom have said that eventually there will have to be a negotiated solution. It has upended the traditional Cold War policy of making sure that Moscow and Beijing remain separate. It's pushed Russia, a country rich in natural resources, into the arms of an industrial and technological giant, China. I think a lot of this has to do with the loss of U.S. hegemony. Of course, China is the real prize, and that's why we see this kind of NATO expansion into countries like Korea, Japan, everywhere else. It's why we see the nuclear submarine deal with Australia. It's why we see long patrols in the South China Sea, which would be the equivalent of China essentially sending aircraft carriers and destroyers to go up and down the coast of California. But these people have been around for a very long time. I know how they think. I know and have interviewed many of them. And they're very dangerous because they are blinded by their own hubris, blinded by their own power, although, of course, they have orchestrated one military fiasco after another, starting with Vietnam, 20 years in the Middle East. So they're very dangerous people. And, of course, finally, both Russia and China are nuclear powers. And what we're doing is essentially flirting with a nuclear conflagration. So they're very dangerous people. And it doesn't matter which administration is in power. I mean, Victoria Nuland was Dick Cheney's chief foreign policy advisor when he was the vice president, and now, of course, she's in the State Department under Biden.
I was just thinking of Victoria Nuland because, she's Robert Kagan's wife. And you mentioned him at the very beginning. It's like the swamp has not been drained. They're all still the same people from both, working in the background within both parties.
Yeah, okay, if I can just jump in. Everything you were saying there, Chris, it really reminded me of an article that stuck with me that you wrote a little while back called No Way Out But War. And when you were speaking, I was just looking up, and you said in that article, you said, permanent war has cannibalized the country. It has created a social, political, and economic morass. Each new military debacle is another nail in the coffin of Pax Americana, end quote. That's a really interesting quote. Are you suggesting there that you think American dominance is on the decline? And if so, do you think that makes the United States a more or less dangerous place vis-a-vis the rest of the world?
Well, it's clearly on the decline, as anybody who drives through large swaths of the United States will tell you. One decayed city after another, all of the mechanisms of repression that were tested largely on people of color, the way the Israelis do in Gaza, have migrated back to the homeland. Militarized drones, wholesale surveillance, militarized police. We run the largest prison system in the world, 25% of the world's prisoners, although we are only, we're less than 5% of the world's population. So we're dying the same way any empire dies. And what happens, and I just as a caveat would say, I studied classics at Harvard, so I'm acutely familiar with the trajectory of the Athenian Empire and the Roman Empire, which died in much the same way. And what happens is that in the inception of empire, they actually use military force very judiciously. But at the end of empire, when they lose that hegemony, they engage in what historians call micro-militarism, and that is they carry out acts of military adventurism that are self-destructive, and that certainly is exactly what the United States has done now for decades, and that is what led to the collapse of both the Roman and the Athenian Empire. In the case of Athens, they attacked Sicily and their fleet was sunk, and most of their soldiers were killed, and then the empire fragmented, and there were uprisings throughout the empire. In Rome, it was, again, the dominance of this military machine, 1 million man army that was finally in the final stages of Rome auctioning off the seat of empire. That militarism, when it becomes uncontrollable, it's what the German socialist Karl Liebknecht called the enemy from within, will disembowel the country, which it's done. But also it's unregulated. There's no restraint. There's no control. And this is what Toynbee, the historian Arnold Toynbee, also cites the rampant, unchecked militarism as the most fatal force in terms of the death of empire. I mean, we have essentially allowed China through deindustrialization. That comes, of course, with seeking cheap labor to hollow out the industrial power of the United States. The Chinese economy, I can't remember by what years, is set to overtake the American economy. And I think that loss of capitalist dominance, coupled with the cracks or the rise of this multipolar world. And then, finally, we have to acknowledge what will be the fatal blow, and that is the loss of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. We're already seeing China, Russia, Iran, other countries attempt to set up an alternative SWIFT system, as the international money transfer system, that doesn't use the dollar. And we know exactly how that will play out, because when the pound sterling was dropped as the world's reserve currency in Britain in the 1950s, the British economy went into a tailspin. We'll be far worse off, because we fund our military, like much of our government, on debt, and people will not be buying treasury bonds. The value of the dollar will drop precipitously, and the empire itself will become unaffordable. We won't be able to maintain the 750 military bases that are scattered around the globe. So that all of that is coming, and what we're seeing is a kind of desperation on the part of the militarists who are stoking, or the way essentially to deal with that decline is to stoke a confrontation directly with China, and they're planning for it. I mean, we have U.S. Marines are training on storming islands because that's exactly what they would have to do if there was a confrontation with China. So yeah, these people are really, really frightening, and they have essentially orchestrated one military fiasco after another. I mean, in any functioning state, these people would be held accountable, certainly for the 20 years of war crimes that they committed throughout the Middle East. But of course, they're not. They're not held accountable by the press. They're not held accountable by the power structure, which is an appendage of corporate America, and in particular the arms industry. And so they're allowed to, they've kind of gotten us in this death embrace as we waltz forward towards catastrophe.
And I want to steer this question towards you, Alan. But before I do that, I want to just share this tweet here by John Pilger. 1 second, let me get this out. And it's about Papua New Guinea. So John Pilger just tweeted, unknown to most, Papua New Guinea has agreed or otherwise been bribed to allow the U.S. to take over the impoverished island state's ports and airports, thus completing the noose of U.S. bases around eastern China. The U.S. will get its war if you allow it. And obviously, John Pilger's, well-known journalist and director of the film The Coming War with China, which I recommend everybody watch. But here we are with another war gearing up towards China. So, Alan, my question for you is, what is driving all of this? I mean, why is the United States turning its gaze towards China in simple terms? What explains the seemingly new focus on Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to start off with that film, The Coming War of China, it came out quite a while ago now. And when I saw it first, I thought, well, this is a prediction, but maybe it's a bit alarmist. But now it seems completely, Pilger seems Cassandra-like in his predictions on what was going to happen. And it seems that, we're rapidly racing towards this nuclear Armageddon. And I think you can't really understand this unless you really think about the United States seeing itself as a global empire. I know people like Abby Martin and the Empire Files talk about this a lot, whereby they say, ultimately, the United States thinks of itself as a planetary power which attempts to control as much of the globe as possible. If you go back, even way back into the 1940s, just at the end of World War II, at 1949, all of these US war planners in their secret or internal documents, governmental or in big think tanks, were talking about the loss of China. Now, if you think about what that means, really, you can't really lose something unless you own it. And that was the mentality back then when Mao Zedong and the communists took power in the 1940s. They saw themselves as losing China. a lot of people don't know that the United States actually invaded China in 1945 and occupied the country with tens of thousands of troops for 4 years until 1949, when they were kicked out and their allies, the Kuomintang, fled to Taiwan, which is actually one of the reasons why this conflict is starting to flare up again. The United States was furious at China for becoming independent. And that really lasted until the 1970s and the administration of Richard Nixon. They refused to recognize the government in Beijing until then. But after that, we saw like a 30, 40-year period whereby relations with China were much less strained. And in fact, you could say even good. But this really changes in the early 2010s in the Obama administration with the pivot to Asia, is what he called it. And what he meant by that was drawing down the troops in the Middle East, which is, of course, part of Asia, but moving them off to the east to confront what he saw as this rising dragon, this rising economic power that needed to be dealt with. And part of that is what Pilger is talking about in that tweet there. The United States has encircled China from the south, the southeast, and the east with a ring of some 400 military bases. This one in Papua New Guinea appears to just be the latest one. But only weeks ago, the Philippines was announcing that it was giving 4 new bases to the United States as well. And so much of this is being driven by what we call the military-industrial complex. That's not just the big arms companies which make billions off of wars every time we go out. There is a myriad of think tanks in Washington and New York which are funded by these weapons manufacturers and who constantly put out reports talking about how there's this new threat along the horizon. We have to deal with it. We have to build up our military. We have to keep spending, and we have to keep pushing the ante up and up just in case something happens. And we've seen this in the last few years, that China has become the new threat, really. In the last few years, we've seen Chinese people demonized because of COVID. We've seen suddenly the plight of Chinese minorities in Xinjiang or Hong Kong or Tibet being front page news. Now, I'm not saying that those aren't real issues, but what I am saying is that the United States is very cynically using these problems inside China to try to drum up resentment and ultimately try to weaken the government in Beijing. A lot of this is actually happening. One little flavor of this is actually happening because the government of Taiwan, which is very independence-minded, has been funneling millions of dollars into a lot of these think tanks in DC and in New York, for instance. It's given millions to groups like CSIS or the Atlantic Council or the Hudson Institute, which in turn fly over President Tsai Ing-wen and wine and dine her and treat her like she is a beacon of democracy in East Asia. All the while, this is ramping up the threat of a nuclear Armageddon with China, which would kill us all. And so ultimately, we are in a situation where Taiwan appears to be looking like it's going to be the Ukraine of East Asia. And ultimately, that's not going to benefit anybody, certainly not the Taiwanese people. But if the United States and China engage in any kind of serious, protracted war, it will likely mean the end of all of us, because if nuclear weapons get involved, then 99% of humanity is going to die. And so that is really why everybody should be looking at this very skeptically. And we should be having mass movements in the streets to try to stop this madness before it gets started.
Well, I would love to see that happen as well, but it seems like the anti-war movement, especially in the United States, has been completely co-opted. But I hope that there is some serious organizing coming soon. The United States frames this conflict with China, of course, just like it does with any other conflict, as one between democracy and authoritarian autocracies. So do you think that this is what this is all about? And what does it say about the U.S. mentality if, as you've noted, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton calls the Pacific Ocean, the American Sea? And that question is for Alan.
It's for me. Yeah. Well, I think the United States tends to frame most conflicts like that they are the beacon, they are the shining city on the hill, and that their enemies are, hopelessly authoritarian or bad in some way. But ultimately, when you look back over the decades, even centuries of conflicts the United States has been involved in, they are very often, in fact, usually the bad guys. There was a recent report done by a US governmental body which actually showed that there has been more than 250 military interventions by the United States since the end of the Cold War in 1991. There's barely been a year since the United States founding back in the late 18th century where the country has not been at war. This country is addicted to it, and it's how the country really functions. In fact, Chris knows this better than almost anybody. He wrote a whole book on it, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, that really, details this suicidal drive towards war. And so, ultimately, if we don't understand this as the United States being some kind of huge global empire, which is hell-bent on controlling as much of the planet as possible, we're not going to really understand this conflict or any conflict in any kind of detail. And so that's why we really need to wash away this kind of framing of democracy versus authoritarian.
Right.
The US enemies might be authoritarian, they might not be, but that's not what this conflict is about. It's not what any conflict that involves the United States is really about either.
Absolutely not. They're, of course, always there to fuel the military-industrial complex. And Chris, at a recent anti-war event in DC, you were excoriating a group you called the High Priests of Empire, meaning journalists, pundits, and politicians. You've seen war up close and personal, and you have suffered serious professional consequences for speaking out against it. Why is it that so few people in similar positions do so, especially these days, instead they're cheerleading for more war?
Well, because it's about careerism. It's was clear. I mean, for instance, I spent 7 years in the Middle East. There wasn't any daylight between myself and the other reporters in the Middle East about the folly of attempting to invade and occupy Iraq, but the other reporters were smart enough to be quiet because it was a career killer to come out and attack this call to invade Iraq, as I knew what I was doing. So it's careerism. You have people, all sorts of people, George Packer and others who were cheerleaders for the war, who didn't come out of the Middle East. They didn't know, it didn't make any difference. And those of us who actually had experience on the ground, including in Iraq, were shut out. I think it's primarily careerism. I worked at the New York Times. It's a very careerist institution. And they know how to read, what's good for their career and what's not. So I think that's really what it comes down to.
Well, and it seems like we're seeing that kind of same careerism within the political system as well when it comes to people like AOC, who do, a lot of good things, for many issues. But then when it comes to war, they're still pushing Russiagate. They're still pushing the same narratives that come out of the State Department. Is that what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, the so-called squad has been told that if they want to have political viability, they'll dance to the tune that the Democratic leadership plays. And if they don't dance to that tune, they'll go the way of Dennis Kucinich, who's was because of redistricting or gerrymandering in Ohio by the Democratic Party, was pushed out of the House. So it's a very unforgiving system, and they'll lose their media perch as well. I mean, if you don't parrot back the dominant narrative, you don't get on the commercial media, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, anywhere else.
And we saw that with Ilhan Omar when she just stepped out of the norm and talked about the Israel lobby for just a moment, one statement.
Well, that didn't last too long, did it? That didn't last too long.
It didn't last too long, but yes, you're right. But in that moment, she was completely smeared and targeted in a pretty cruel campaign, unfortunately. Go ahead, Alan.
I was just thinking, we haven't really talked about Ukraine too much. Chris, you write about Ukraine a lot. One interesting article I was reading just before this is called Ukraine's Death by Proxy, which you can find at chrishedges.substack.com. In that, you wrote that Ukraine is a pawn for militarists intent on degrading Russia and ultimately China in a self-defeating quest to ensure US global hegemony. The end of this war, like most proxy wars, will be ugly. Can you unpack that for us? What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, because proxy wars always, and I've covered many of them, the Kurds, and they always end with betrayal. They will sell Ukraine out as soon as Ukraine can no longer serve the interests of the U.S. empire. Right now, Europe is being made to pay the price of the proxy war, the double-digit inflation. The German industry is crippled with a high price of natural gas, etc. There'll probably be rationing and heating shortages this coming winter. And although we suffer from inflation, we're not as economically impacted. That would change with a war with China, because a war with China would disrupt the global supply chain. In companies like Apple, for instance, I mean, Apple produces 90% of its products in China. We had $690 billion in trade with China last year. As I mentioned before, China's manufacturing has double that of the United States since 2004. It produces the largest number of ships, steel, smartphones. It dominates the global market in terms of chemicals, metals, heavy industrial equipment, electronics. It's the largest exporter of rare earth minerals, as well as the greatest reserve holder. Now, these are and it has 80% of the refining of rare earth metals worldwide. Now, these are essential for computer chips, smartphones, television screens, medical equipment, fluorescent light bulbs, cars, wind turbines, fighter jets, satellite communications, etc. So a war with China would have an economic impact on the United States that the proxy war with Russia in Ukraine is not having. You would have a massive shortage of a variety of goods and services. You definitely trigger serious inflation, certainly double-digit inflation, widespread unemployment, probably at least initially rationing. I don't see how the global stock exchanges in a war with China would even be able to operate, certainly in the short term, and it would trigger a global depression. So what these militarists are doing, and we're already, of course, the frayed political establishment in the United States. They are anemic political, the bifurcation of the country into antagonistic tribes, the gun violence. I mean, all of this would be exacerbated. So I think what we would really see is tremendous internal upheaval with a war with China. That doesn't matter to these people because it's all about the profits for Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin, whose profits have increased by about 40% because of the Ukraine conflict. That's what it's about. But the internal consequences would be really severe.
If you're just joining us, you're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges. If you're watching on YouTube, please do like and share the stream. And there is a donate button down below. If you are in an economic position to help us, that would be very helpful, especially if you could become a Patreon. Chris, the Biden administration's latest military budget, as we touched on a little bit earlier, is set to be the largest in history. And there was a report that said it was as much as 144 countries combined. And as you said, that doesn't even include things like nuclear weapons and veterans' pensions. So why does this budget always increase? And hopefully I'm not leading you too much here, but is this spending necessary or beneficial for the American people or for anyone?
Well, it increases because the military establishment has no regulation, oversight, or control. So, in fact, in this last budget, the Pentagon got $45 billion more than the Biden administration even requested. There's no auditing. I don't think they've audited the Pentagon in over a decade. waste, fraud, which we know is rampant.
That's incredible.
It's just not controlled. So, and that gets back to the point I made earlier. An out-of-control militarism, as Toynbee wrote, is the death knell of any empire. So it's a state within a state. Neither party has any capacity to rein in or control the military, and that's what kills empire.
And we just have one more question here, and this one goes to Alan. We want to talk about the big TikTok craze. While we are now, deluged with stories about China's influence on America, your investigations, Alan, have suggested that some of that is overblown. I'm thinking especially about your article on TikTok's Trust and Safety Division being full of ex-State Department employees. And I believe it was just, was it today or yesterday? I think it was Montana that completely banned TikTok under the banner of it being a Chinese intelligence app. Can you tell us about TikTok?
Yeah, that's
TikTok
right.
Craze.
TikTok is absolutely huge. It is the number one social media for young people under 30 the world over. It has grown from a tiny site to something which has something close to about 1 billion users globally in no time at all. And as you said, in this climate of suspicion, we've seen Montana being the first state to pretty much outright ban the app. It's not banning Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, but it is banning TikTok. Now, I have my problems with TikTok. I think it will ruin your attention span. It does collect personal data. But the things that are wrong with TikTok can really be levied at the other big social media apps as well. And this isn't the first time that we've seen a lot of hype around TikTok, a lot of hysteria over the app in Washington. You might remember a couple of years ago, the Trump administration made a big noise about banning TikTok entirely. And it even forced through a lot of draconian legislation to the point where TikTok was actually going to be sold to Microsoft. But very quietly and very quickly, that deal was completely dropped. And nobody even seemed to know why. Even Microsoft itself was in the dark. And what we found out a little bit later was TikTok had come to some sort of agreement with the US government to begin what it called something called Project Texas, which was essentially bringing all this big hardware over and storing it in Texas, in the United States, and bringing in dozens, if not hundreds, of quote unquote former State Department, former FBI, and former CIA officials to run the company's most sensitive divisions, like trust and safety, like security, and like content moderation. And so what I found in my investigations, which really just involved looking at who were some of the most influential people at TikTok and starting to scrutinize some of their backgrounds, was that an alarming number of them had long careers in the national security state. So just as a couple of examples, Christian Cardona enjoyed a distinguished career at the State Department. He served in Poland, Turkey, and Oman, and he was in the thick of US interventionism in the Middle East in the 2010s. For instance, between 2012 and 2013, he was an assistant to the US ambassador in Kabul in Afghanistan. And then he later left that role to become the political and military affairs manager for Iran, for the United States on Iran. And yet, from this long career as a distinguished Mandarin, in the summer of 2021, he dropped all of that and went straight from a top job at the State Department to become the product policy manager for trust and safety at TikTok, which on paper is a move that he appears completely and utterly unqualified for. He is certainly not the only person. We could have a look at somebody like TikTok Trust and Safety Manager Bo Pattison, who was until 2020 a CIA targeting analyst, meaning that he was choosing the sorts of targets that the CIA would go after, perhaps with drones. Not only that, he, according to his resume on LinkedIn, is still a serving military intelligence officer at the US Army, while moonlighting as the trust and safety manager for TikTok. And perhaps the most startling of these hires that I found was Greg Anderson, whose own profile suggests that outright states that he worked on, quote, psychological operations, end quote, for NATO immediately before moving into social media. So why are all these people moving into highly politically sensitive fields within social media like TikTok? They're not going into marketing or customer sales or anything like, service related. They're going into the areas whereby they have a say on what algorithms produce. In other words, they are deciding what we see and what we don't see. And it's not just for Americans. This is the case whether you're in Cameroon, Chad, or Canada. It doesn't matter. If you're using TikTok or another big social media app where former three-letter agency guys are absolutely full or just stacking the employment rosters there. This is really an incredible thing that's going on, whereby the United States government really has a sort of one step away from government censorship on a global scale. And this is going on almost completely unmentioned by much of the media. And so ultimately, I would say that, if people are going to ban TikTok, you can perhaps talk about it being no good for your brain. But ultimately, I don't think it's any more dangerous a threat than any of the rest. And this is a huge political football that's being kicked about right now. And it's got very little to do with the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is reading all your DMs or anything. It's more about control over one of the world's most important and influential methods of communication today.
Well, isn't it so interesting how everything that we project and accuse, everything we accuse China and Russia of doing when it comes to surveillance, we are actually doing it already here through our social media giants like Facebook and Twitter. It's if not even worse. And what's really interesting about TikTok is that, sure, it's a highly addictive and problematic social media platform for young people. We can all acknowledge that. And yet the NATO officials, or not NATO officials, but the NATO to TikTok pipeline is allowing for Washington to literally train TikTok influencers on how to talk about the war in Ukraine, while actively censoring posts by Palestinian activists who are uploading content to show the brutality of the Israeli occupation and apartheid and its crimes in Gaza. And so it's really interesting to see that this war on TikTok is taking place, and yet they are actively using it as, for a very successful psychological warfare campaign. But anyways, that should wrap it up for today. But we really appreciate you all joining us today. And Chris, thank you so much for being with us. It was truly an honor and pleasure to have you. As usual, we always learn a lot from you. And also we always learn a lot from the brilliant Alan MacLeod. And so that's it for our broadcast today. And you can find this live stream in audio format through all of your favorite podcast platforms when you search for MintCast. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.